We're going to solve quadratic equations by factoring. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use what's called the zero product property. And the zero product property tells me that if I multiply two numbers together and my result is 0, then either one or the other of those numbers must be equal to 0. So if I multiply two numbers together and they equal 0, then one of those numbers has to be 0 itself. Otherwise, it's impossible to get 0, right? 5 times 3 is not 0, is it? One of them has to be 0. So we're going to use what's called the zero product property then. And so if we look at it algebraically here, it says if AB equals 0, then either A equals 0 or B equals 0. In other words, we're going to take the factors and set them equal to 0 and solve. So we have two examples here that we're going to look at. So I have two factors here. The two factors are x minus 7 and x plus 2. If I multiply them together and they equal 0, then that means that either x minus 7 equals 0 or x plus 2 equals 0. So then we just solve those two equations. To get rid of the minus 7, we add 7 to both sides. To get rid of the plus 2, we subtract 2 from both sides. So then x equals 7 or negative 2. If I put 7 in for x in both of them, then the one on the left would be 0. If I put negative 2 in for both of them, then the one on the right would be equal to 0. And so if we did that multiplication, we would get 0. All right, letter B. Once again, I have two factors here. The factors are x and x minus 2. When I multiply them together, they equal 0. So that means then that either x is going to equal 0 or x minus 2 equals 0. So we get x equals 0 or add 2 to both sides, x equals positive 2. So either of those two numbers is going to cause that function to be equal to 0. All right, so we're going to do the same thing, solving by factoring, but we're actually going to have to factor the quadratics first. So there's a couple things you have to remember to do think about when you're doing this. And one of them is that we need to have it equal to 0 before we start. So our quadratic function that we have, that we're working with, we always want it to be in this form. So we want everything on either the left or the right side of the parenthesis or equal sign. It doesn't matter which. But we need to get, if we're going to solve by factoring, we need to set it equal to 0. So that means we might need to add or subtract something to the other side. So letter A says x squared minus 6x plus 8 equals 0. So we're going to take x squared minus 6x plus 8, and we're going to factor it first of all. So Natalie, what do I get when I factor that? Okay, you agree with that then? All right. So Nathan, what did you get for an answer here? Okay, x equals 2 or x equals 4. Okay, good. All right, everybody agree with that? Okay. All right, now letter B, it's not equal to 0. So I have to get it equal to 0 first. So my first step here then has to be to subtract 21 from both sides. Now here's where one of the largest mistakes that people make are sometimes is just understanding the fact that if I subtract 21 from the left side, I'm not subtracting it from x squared or the 4x because it's not like terms with them, so it's a separate piece that goes on the end. So make sure you don't combine unlike terms. Now we can factor that. All right, we have a volunteer who would like to factor that. All right, Natalie. X plus 7 and x minus 3. Very good. Okay. 3 times 7 is 21, and 7 minus 3 is 4. So then I'm going to set each of those then equal to 0. And when I solve them then, we get x equals -7 or x equals +3. Anybody see a pattern yet? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So we'll hold that thought and come back to it. All right, Nolan? I mean, Wolverine. You get that right. Don't want to mess up your name. Okay. Okay. Letter C here. Now for letter C, I only have one thing on the left side, don't I? And it just happens to be that thing that's squared. Now, if it was positive, I would probably leave it there and move the other two to the left side. But since it's negative, I'm going to move that to the other side and have my 0 be there. But watch how I write this when we're not. So we're going to add 2x squared to both sides. So we get 2x squared plus 20x plus 50 equals 0. Does it matter whether I put the 0 on the left or the right? Does it matter whether it equals 0, excuse me, equals 0 over here on the right, or whether I put it over here and make it on the left? Does it matter? No, it's equal to 0, right? So I prefer working on the left side. How many of you prefer to work with the left side? Okay. All right. Some of you might prefer the right. If you do, leave it there then. Okay. It's up to you. All right. Now, what do you notice about all these numbers, 2, 20, and 50? They are all positive, but they're also even numbers, okay? Divisible by 2, right? So my next step then, if I'm solving equations, if I can get rid of anything, like a greatest common factor, then I want to do that. So I'm going to divide all of these by 2 first, or my next step. So then I have a much easier quadratic function to work with. And not only that, but I heard somebody mention it. Oops, get on here. That we actually have something else. Anybody know what it's called? This is a perfect square trinomial. Okay. Right, because we're going to get x plus 5 and x plus 5 when we factor, which means there's only one factor, and it has something that in Algebra C you will learn is called multiplicity, okay, because it has more than one common factor, so we call it, say, we would have multiplicity of 2. So then we will set that equal to 0, and we will get negative 5 as our answer. So before we do letter D, because letter D's got a 3 in front of the answer, yes. Yes, you may. Notice all of these, that when I factored, that when I got, here's my factor, yeah, we use this one. Here's my factor here. My 0 is negative 5. Okay? X plus 5, I have a 0 of negative 5. Up here, here's my factors. X plus 7, I had a 0 of negative 7. X minus 3, I have a 0 of positive 3. Here, x minus 2 and x minus 4. The zeros are the opposites. Okay? How many of you saw that already? Good. Hopefully you do. Now, and that even happened over here, that we had our zeros of x minus 7 and x plus 2 gave us positive 7 and negative 2 for our zeros. Okay? Factors here of 0 or of x and x minus 2 gave me 0 and positive 2. Now, when we look at letter D, that changes. Okay? And we'll see why. So now we need to factor this one. So we've got to use that little slide and divide method, maybe. Okay? All right? Maybe some of you can do it without. Now here's one thing. If I factor this, I know I have to have 3x here and x here. How many people know that? It's got to be a 3x and an x. Okay? Because that's the only way to get 3x squared, right? Is to multiply those two together. Okay? Well, what goes in the other parts of the parentheses? What two numbers multiply together equal 1? 1 and 1, right? Okay, so these two have to have a 1. Now the question is, what goes between them? Right? And here's a rule, if you remember this correctly, from when you factored before, that when this is positive, the signs have to be the same, right? Okay? Because a positive times a positive is a positive, and a negative times a negative is a positive. Okay? So that means that these two signs here between them in the middle here have to be the same, and those two signs are always the same as that middle one right there, so they're minus. So we just factored that by using our basic knowledge that we know about factors. Okay? We didn't need to slide and divide or like that. You could have if you had to. Right? If you don't see that right away, you can. But whenever your first term, the 3x squared, if there's only one way to write that, then go ahead and write that right away. Okay? All right, so now we set them equal to 0. And now that I think about it, I'm going to go back through and do the slide and divide and show you a nice little trick about slide and divide. Okay. Now, this one over here on the right, all right, that's easy. That's x equals 1. Is this one equal to 1 also? No, it's not, because we have a 3x here, not just x. So we have to add 1 and then divide by 3. So we get 1/3 or 1. Now, I'm going to show you a little key about slide and divide and why slide and divide helps you with when you're solving equations. Okay? Because when you slide and divide for the factoring, it actually puts you in a position that looks like x plus 5 or x minus 5. Okay? So we got what, 3x squared minus 4x plus 1. So I'm going to do the slide and divide method here. Just remind you how to do it then. Okay? All right, so step 1, we multiply a times c, right? Okay? 3 times 1. So we get x squared minus 4x plus 3. Okay? Step 2, we factor it. X minus 3 and x minus 1. You notice, okay? The 3 is positive. The 4 is negative. Okay? These two signs are the same. They're both negative in this case. So now we divide by a. Step 3, dividing by a. So we get x minus 3 over 3 and x minus 1 over 3. We said we would simplify them. Oh, look at that. I have factors that have a 1 in front of them. So the zeros are 1 or 1/3. So the slide and divide method actually puts you in this position here to where your zeros are just the opposites. Okay? So it actually helps you in that with finding the answers when you're solving quadratic equations. That make sense? Okay. Matt?